So the other day, Nintendo put out an Ask the Developer article for Mario Kart World, and if you're wondering what these articles are, they are basically an interview with the developers of the game or the hardware. They did one for Nintendo Switch 2 itself, so we got some hardware behind the scenes, but now they have one for Mario Kart World. So we have some behind the scenes on the development of the game, and some extra footage of Mario Kart World, so there's a lot to unpack here, and I felt that it needed its own video, so I decided to make it. And depending on how you look at the article, it could be justification for the $80 price tag, it might not be, it all depends on how you look at it, but there is a lot of info here that kind of reveals, in my opinion, why it's $80, but that's really up to your judgment. But real quickly before we get started, I would really appreciate if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. I do have a Nintendo Switch 2 pre-order and I plan to unbox and review it on this channel, and subscribing and liking this video are going to make it a lot easier for you to find when I make that video, and if you want to make it even easier, you can turn on all post notifications by clicking the bell below. But with that out of the way, let's get right into the video. So on part 1 of the article, the developers are kind of introducing themselves and kind of saying some general things about Mario Kart World. A lot of stuff we already know, but there's one thing that's really interesting here, and it's that this article settles a long-time debate that has been going on about, is Mario Kart Tour a mainline game in the Mario Kart series? And basically what they say is, the interviewer asks, I'd like to ask about the title first. Was it always the plan to call it Mario Kart World rather than Mario Kart 9? And then Yabuki, who is the producer, I'm pretty sure, of the game, he says, if the idea had just been to add more courses, then I think we would have called it Mario Kart 9. So right out of the bag here, the producer of Mario Kart World has just ended the entire debate of, is Mario Kart Tour a mainline game? And he just said that they would have called Mario Kart World Mario Kart 9, basically acknowledging that Tour is not a mainline game. So really cool that we got to end that debate. It was kind of interesting that they mentioned that. This article also has some early imagery of the game from when it was first a concept, and it's really cool to look at because a lot of the stuff looks a lot different than how it does now, but the concept of the world, the open world, seems to have been basically stuck to this game from conception, and they just carried through with that concept, so I imagine the game feels completely like it is open world. That is what it was intended to be from conception, is that it was going to be open world, and the game is designed around that. And then the developers start talking about how they wanted to model this game after Super Mario Kart, which was the original entry in the series on the Super Nintendo, and they really liked the chaotic vibe of that game, which is kinda interesting to me because I did not like that game solely for that purpose, so I really hope Mario Kart World improves that, because from the trailer footage of Mario Kart World that we've gotten, we've seen that it's going to have 24 players, which is double of the 12 that we've had in previous entries, and then there are a lot of new items in Mario Kart World that just make the experience more chaotic as a whole, so hopefully it doesn't reflect this Super Nintendo version too much. I imagine it won't, because the Super Nintendo version was basically 2D, the developers just kind of manipulated it and made it 3D, but Mario Kart World's obviously a lot more modern than Super Mario Kart, so I'm not too concerned about it, but hopefully it's not too chaotic. And then the developers started talking about the overall theme of the graphics of this game, and you can kind of tell if you watch the trailers that this is the intent. They wanted to make Mario Kart World more playful, and you can kind of see how it's more cartoony, versus 8 Deluxe feeling like cartoonish but very realistic at the same time. Just the graphics, somehow they pulled it off where it felt like something that could be kinda real, and that could have been because the anti-gravity was a big deal in Mario Kart 8, but it looks like Nintendo is interested in pursuing its child audience that plays these games. I'm not saying that older people don't, because I know that a lot do, but it seems like they're wanting to kind of head back to their roots from when these games were mostly meant for kids, and there weren't really any adult gamers, since all of the adult gamers now were just gamers when they were kids. But the developers basically say they just wanted to make the characters a little more lively, and I think making them more playful was the way to do that. The developers also discussed how they wanted to make the soundtrack more lively and powerful, in their words, to fit this playfulness vibe, so I'll play that video for you right now. The developers then started talking about how they wanted to make the player count be 24 because they thought 12 was too little, and they wanted to make sure that players would interact with each other a lot more often than they did previously, which I can agree. 12 players was a bit empty, especially if you were in first place. You could really get ahead of people or out of people's way, but Nintendo's goal here is to not allow that and make sure that you are constantly in the middle of other players. And then in part 2 of the article, the developers start discussing how they were actually planning to put the game on Nintendo Switch, but it was taking them a really long time, and they weren't actually able to run it as well as they wanted to on the Switch. So from 2017 to 2020, as they discuss, they had been planning to put it on Switch, but in 2020, once they started getting specs about Switch 2, they thought about moving it to Switch 2, and then they just decided that was the way to go because they could actually get the game running completely at 60 FPS on Switch 2, and they could add everything they wanted to on Switch 2, so that's why they put it there. And it's really interesting that this was not always a Switch 2 game. For a while, Nintendo was actually planning to make Mario Kart World a Switch 1 game, but, that worked out in their favor, I guess, because Mario Kart 8 Deluxe still has sold like 65 million units, I think, even though it was a port from the Wii U, so pretty interesting. And then the developers started talking about how much more they could do graphics-wise by putting the game on Switch 2, and they discussed how, they couldn't put as many trees as they wanted on Switch. Now they could. They couldn't have the frame rate at 60 FPS, now they could, so it looks like this game definitely should have been on Switch 2, and it's probably good that it's coming out on it, because it doesn't seem like it could have met its full potential on Nintendo Switch. And then there's another clip on the article of Mario driving down Mario Bros. Circuit in free roam. I'll play that clip for you. And then they kind of discuss how it was more difficult to implement returning courses into an open world because, it's open, you can drive around everywhere, so that means that the music tracks are going to be a bit different, and then they had to make sure that the scenery fits the world more appropriately. The developers also discussed how the music that plays in free roam mode is dependent on where you are and what's happening, which kind of makes sense. Free roam is a really huge mode, and you might not always be in the same area, so the music has to change accordingly. They called this in the interview a jukebox of songs because there are so many. They say that there are over 200 songs. The developers also discussed how they wanted to make the weather kind of varying so that they could make the courses more full of emotion, which I think the weather's really cool. It could make courses feel completely different when you're driving down them at certain times. And with the weather and the daylight cycle changing, the developers discuss how it took their graphics team a lot longer to get it done because, the daylight cycle, the weather, it basically changes how the entire course looks. The developers also mention how the daylight cycle is 24 minutes, and for those who are more acquainted with Minecraft, the daylight cycle there is 20 minutes, so Mario Kart World's daylight cycle is about 4 minutes more than Minecraft. The devs also discuss how drifting is normally the way that you turn in Mario Kart, but they wanted to make it more interesting and less boring, so they added rail grinding and wall driving so that it's a little bit more interesting when you drift, and they can add different ways to trick, and they say how they were inspired by skateboards because they kind of can trick everywhere, and they implemented that in Mario Kart World. And then by now we're at part 3 of the article, where the interviewer basically asks the developer about concept art, and they have some examples here. I'll show them on screen. And you can see how there are many different ideas that the developers had when they made this game. They were pretty set on what they wanted to do, it's just putting it all into play. The developers then start talking about food in Mario Kart World, which is basically diverse to the area of the map you're in, and if you didn't already know, it changes the costume your character is wearing. So there's some concept art of it that I'll also show on screen. Kind of a funny side note, but the developers did also mention that Mario does indeed eat mushrooms in the Mario games, if you were concerned about that at all. The developers then discussed the unlikely and interesting new set of characters in the roster, and particularly the one that's been catching everybody's interest is the cow, because it's been getting a lot of time in the trailers, and the developers basically said they're running out of characters to actually make brand new for the games, so they decided to take characters from the actual courses that are going to be in the game, and they made them playable. And the sketch that you see on your screen is the original one of the cow that one of the developers drew up, and then they really liked the idea, so they ultimately decided to add the cow and the other course-themed characters into the game as playable characters. They also call these characters NPC drivers because they're not actually characters playable in the Mario games, more like NPCs. The developers then go on to discuss how they wanted to make the karts all-terrain vehicles because this game is more focused on driving through the interconnected world and off-road at times. Now, I'm not sure how it'll function in the actual races, if it will be like past Mario Kart games where you need a mushroom to effectively get through any of the off-road areas. Although in free roam, I have no doubt that you do drive faster than you do in previous games through the off-road sections, because that is kind of what free roam is all about. They then go on to talk about how you can now drive on top of the water rather underwater like in 8 Deluxe. They kind of mention Wave Race 64 on the Nintendo 64 as their kind of inspiration for having the characters drive on water. And then part 4 of the article, the final part, starts with approachability. And approachability is pretty important in an open world interconnected map because there are going to be intersections because different tracks, different destinations, just like in real life. So they kind of have different ways that they make the road clear in the direction that you're driving so that you don't go down the wrong intersection. And so that players who might not have played it before understand where to go. This differs for those who have the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass. You'll know that there are these arrows, especially on the Mario Kart Tour courses, that guide you certain ways because those tour courses change every lap. And they didn't want to go the lazy route this time, so they actually added landmarks to kind of make it clear which way to go. And it looks a lot better because I did not like the way those arrows looked. I never did, so I'm glad that they're ditching that. And then they discuss how long they've been working on these games and how they understand how players think when they're driving, so they wanted to make it an experience where you understand what to do and you still feel like it's a natural course. And then the developers talk about the P-switch missions that are kind of spread throughout free roam mode, where you have to get to the end of it by pressing the P switch, and I imagine there's some kind of reward. I'm not too sure what that is. It might have been in the Mario Kart World Direct and I just missed it, but these are a lot like Mario Kart DS, where they had missions that you could progress through, so I think free roam's going to be a nice side mode. I'm not sure about the longevity of it, because these missions kind of look like they're one and done, but this map of Mario Kart World as a whole looks like it's pretty big, so there might be a lot of these missions throughout the map. And I'll play that attached clip for you. The developers also discussed the JoyCon wheel for the JoyCon 2s, and if you don't remember, the JoyCon 1 wheel for Nintendo Switch was not very good or very comfortable to use. I felt like the tilt controls were just so insensitive that it felt hard to use tilt controls without turning the wheel very hard, if you get what I'm saying. But they discuss how they've improved the JoyCon wheel. I'm not too sure because $25 for a set of 2 is just pretty steep, and tilt controls are generally not as fun, so I'll have to see and try it to believe it. The developers then talk about how game chat is implemented into Mario Kart World. To save you the time, basically, you can see your friends while you're driving, or you can see them when you're in free roam. It's not anything too fancy. If you watch the Mario Kart World Direct, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Plus, you all have to buy $55 cameras anyway. And that's basically all the developers talk about, so I'm going to end the video here. But before you go, make sure to comment down below what your favorite thing in this article is, or if you think this article justifies the $80 price tag of Mario Kart World more for you. Also, I would really appreciate if you would like the video and subscribe to my channel. As I said before, I do have a Nintendo Switch 2 pre-order that I will be unboxing and reviewing on this channel. But anyway, thanks for watching and have a great day.